you all for coming this evening. I apologize for the delay, but it turned out perfect timing because you guys, you could not have timed it better. Clearly, you were getting the smoke signals about when to show up. So hi everyone, my name's Joe Brewer. I'm going to be your host and presenter this evening. We have Stephen over here doing live streaming and recording, which is why we were a little delayed, is that the technology is different in every place we go. So it's always a creative solution-making process. Anyone who works in media production knows what we're talking about. And I'm actually here tonight as part of the Regenerate Cascadia Bioregional Activation Tour. So we're going to talk about what the heck is bioregional activation. That's part of the focus tonight. But I just wanted to name a few people who are in the room that have helped to make all this happen. So my partner, Penny Heipel, co-founder of the Design School for Regenerating Earth, which is part of the group that is gathering to create landscape leadership and learning exchanges for bioregions around the world. We'll touch on that a little bit in the presentation, but not very much, because we're actually not here to promote ourselves or the other work we are doing. We're here to help catalyze the regeneration of Cascadia. And then we're also here with Claire Atwell and Brandon Letsinger, who are the organizers of Regenerate Cascadia. And they will share a little bit near the end of the presentation about what Regenerate Cascadia is, how they have birthed their parts of all of this, and what we can expect to follow. And then we have Stephen Morris here helping us with tech to be sure that we archive and capture what we're doing, because we are midway through a big tour. We're like a rock band of a sort. That's totally the story I'm telling my daughter. I'm like, I am a rock star dad. My daughter's 6, so she'll believe me for a little longer. Because we're actually traveling through 14 different cities in 30 days, starting the same conversation. And the reason for this, as you will see, is that it's a conversation that absolutely needs to happen. And it absolutely needs to happen for reasons I'll talk about in a moment, which is where we are in the state of the world and what we have to do to avoid human extinction and avoid other rather unpleasant possible outcomes that are looming on the horizon. And so I want to maybe start by offering you my credentials. My credentials have nothing to do with letters behind my name, nor do they have anything to do with my academic degrees or the work that I've done. I have one basis of legitimacy for what I'm going to share with you tonight, which is that as an Earth system scientist who studied the planet and who understands how grave our future is, I chose to bring a child into the world. And so I'm a father, first and foremost. And I think this is my claim to legitimacy, because knowing what I know about the state of the world and what's coming, the fact that I decided to put skin in the game and then wrap it around the body of my child and place her in harm's way for the future that's coming is, I hope, the only legitimacy I need for the message I want to share tonight. Now, I've been given this talk starting in the Columbia River Gorge about 2 weeks ago. Then we were in Eugene, Oregon. Then we were in Portland, Oregon. Then we were in Olympia. And the last 2 days we're on Vashon Island. After we leave here, we're going on to Whidbey Island. Then we're going to Port Townsend and Fort Worden. Then we're going to Victoria on Vancouver Island. Then we're going to Gabriola Island and the Gulf Islands to the north. And then we're going to Bellingham, and then we're going to Skagit Valley, and then we're going back to Seattle. So we're doing this big 30-day figure 8 of the bioregion. For those who don't know, this is the Cascadia bioregion. We'll talk a little bit about that. But mostly what I want to talk to you about is the title of my talk. Because I'm trained in cognitive linguistics, which means I really care about language and how language shapes our reality. And I just want to go through the title of my presentation, because I want you to notice that it's not, do we regenerate Cascadia, as if it's a choice. We have no choice. How do we regenerate Cascadia? So this question of how is a really big one. How do we actually do it? And I'll give you the little punchline. you being here tonight is actually part of how we do it. So we'll see some of that. The other is this word regenerate. So regenerate, coming from the word regeneration, is what like a lizard will do when it drops off its tail and grows its tail back, or a starfish that you cut off one of its arms and it grows its arm back, or my skin, which every 30 days regenerates all layers of the skin through a continual cycle. Regeneration is the dynamic process that causes any living system to continue to be alive moment to moment. So the regeneration of Cascadia is this deep collaboration with the living systems of a bioregion. And then Cascadia is the scale at which we must work as the minimum scale in order to have a chance of a surviving and thriving future. And so we're going to talk about Cascadia as a meshwork of landscapes with more than 430 different watersheds, which includes the entire Colorado Basin. It includes the entire Salish Sea and the Cascade Mountain Range. So it's massively large. It runs from southern Alaska to northern California. It includes part of Wyoming because the Snake River coming out of Yellowstone drains into the Columbia River. It's a massive geography of landscapes. And what I want to talk to you about is how do we do regeneration at this scale? This absolutely necessary and yet seemingly impossible scale. So to do this, I want to start by making a point that many others have made before, but a point that's really, really important, which is that when you look at the Earth from space, you'll notice a complete absence of borders, a complete absence of boundaries. This is a fully integrated, dynamic, and complex system. Just look at the water. There is water in every single pixel of this image because there's all the water in the ocean, and then on the land there are rivers and lakes, and then there are clouds which are made of water, but even the air without clouds has water vapor. Heck, even in the magma pulled down in our subduction zones, water is pulled down into the deep parts of the earth and explode back out during volcanoes. There is water throughout the entire planet. Water touches everything that is alive. It's completely integrated and seamless. Unfortunately, this level of integration brings with it profound systemic risk. So we need to have an understanding of systemic risk to see how to create systemic resilience. Before we can talk about regenerating Cascadia, I want to give the context for why we need to do so. And to do that, I want to give us a little bit of a shared reality check. Like, what is real? Where is the world? How are we doing? Because there's this discourse, like the climate change, climate policy discourse, that says we have till 2030 to avoid abrupt climate change, and otherwise, as long as we adjust CO2 levels, everything's fine. And that's a story that is completely false. Completely false. So where are we? What is the state of the world today? And to give us a snapshot of the state of the world, I want to use a framework called the planetary boundaries. So just show of hands, who here has heard of the planetary boundaries? So a few of you. So the planetary boundaries is a framework developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center. It's a collaboration among 3,500 scientists who study the dynamic Earth. And back in 2009, they asked a very interesting question. They asked, with everything we know about the dynamic Earth, are there any thresholds or boundaries that if we crossed that boundary, we would leave the Holocene period, which is this warm, stable climate that enables us to have things like agriculture, permanent settlements, cities, city-states, empires, civilizations, global supply chains. All of these things depend upon this warm, stable climate that has existed for the last 12,000 years. So like, are there any boundaries that if we cross them, we would leave that safe operating space for humanity? So they started gathering the researchers and having conferences and writing papers, and they found out there are nine of them. And here they are. Climate change is only one of them. There's a lot of talk about climate change, but it's only one. There's also biosphere integrity. Biosphere integrity is the measure of the rate of extinction for species, because as you prune species away from ecosystems, they eventually unravel and collapse. This is the measure of the mass extinction event, the rate of extinction of species. Then there's another one called land system change. Land system change is when you take intact, healthy ecosystems and you degrade them. You cut down forests, create desertification, create agriculture, create urban landscapes, all of which are degraded landscapes. So if there's too much land system change, then you destabilize the whole planet. Then there's freshwater use. Only 1% of all of the water in the world is freshwater, 99% is salt water. So that 1% is precious. And if it becomes too contaminated, or if it becomes unavailable and it doesn't flow, then this could cause a collapse of all of our complex social systems. Then there's biogeochemical flows. It's just a fancy way of saying reactive nitrogen and phosphorus that are used in synthetic fertilizers for industrial agriculture. And these fertilizers, when they flow off of the fields into our rivers and run into the sea, they create massive dead zones, which can destabilize the food chain of the world's ocean. Then there's ocean acidification. If the ocean becomes too acidic, calcium carbonate begins to dissolve. Calcium carbonate is what is used to create the bodies of coral and coral reefs, to create the bodies of mollusks and clams and other shelled organisms in the ocean. So if the ocean acidifies too much, again, a collapse of marine ecosystems. And then there's atmospheric aerosol loading, which is just a fancy way of saying air pollution. There's too much air pollution. Then there's stratospheric ozone depletion, which is in the stratosphere, there's a layer of ozone that absorbs ultraviolet radiation from the sun, which makes it possible for there to be life on the land, on the continents of the Earth. There'd be no life on land if the ultraviolet radiation was rupturing biological cells on the land surface. So you need stratospheric ozone layer. And then number 9, a catch-all called novel entities, which is any chemical produced by humans that the planet doesn't know how to deal with. So there are 9. They identified 9. Like, oh, interesting. If there are 9, there's a natural question that follows, right? How are we doing? Remember, if we cross even 1, this whole experiment of a globalized civilization, or a civilization of any kind, probably goes away because we don't have the conditions for the stability that's needed. So they started doing the research, gathering the data, and in 2015, they published that we'd already crossed 4. We had crossed the boundaries for climate change, the rate of extinction, land system change, which is the destruction of ecosystems, and biogeochemical flows. But then the research continued, and they gathered more data, and they did more studies, and in 2021, they added freshwater use and ocean acidification. It's not to say that we crossed these boundaries between 2015 and 2021, it's that the research became conclusive. And then in 2022, they added novel entities because of microplastics. Because microplastics are hormone disruptors that can be found in every drop of breast milk in every woman on Earth and can be found in every water supply everywhere on Earth. And these are ubiquitous, long-lasting chemicals. So this is how we're doing. This is where we are right now. When you look at this, you might notice that the solution is so obvious. Change your light bulbs. No, that's nuts. Buy consumer products that are greener. Replace the internal combustion engine in your single occupancy vehicle with an electric battery in your single occupancy vehicle. But of course, that battery requires you to scrape the ocean floor and tear off the tops of mountains to get the lithium. But these are good environmental solutions, and you can start to see how absurd our environmental discourse has become. Completely disconnected from reality. What this tells us is that nothing less than a wholesale reimagining of humanity is needed. We must reimagine humanity's place within the Earth, within the living dynamics of the Earth. Now I want to show you a little bit of how these planetary boundaries work. This is a map that summarizes the tipping points of the Earth system. Now these are tipping points of the Earth system. It doesn't include tipping points of social systems. like where there's too much corruption or too much inequality or whatever. There are dynamics in social systems that are not included here. But these are examples of tipping points. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll just give a few examples. The Greenland ice sheet, if it melts, it causes sea level rise. Also, if it melts too quickly, it changes the density of water because of the fresh water, which causes the atmospheric circulation, what's called the thermohaline circulation of the world ocean. It causes it to shut down, which immediately causes chaos in all of our weather systems. There's a dieback of the boreal forest. The boreal forest is the world's largest forest, spanning the Arctic Circle. I don't know if you noticed Canada's wildfires this year, but it seems like the boreal forest is beginning to die back. There's also the Amazon rainforest, which is in the process of collapsing right now, to very soon pass a tipping point and become a grassland savanna, a forest that's lasted for 40 million years. You also have the melting of the permafrost in Siberia, where you have 4 meters thick of frozen tundra. Frozen tundra means frozen vegetation. When that vegetation starts to warm, microbes begin decomposing it. They begin consuming it, and they release methane. And there are massive explosions taking place in Siberia where huge craters are being exploded out of the earth from methane released from the melting permafrost. There's also the West Antarctic ice sheet that, if it falls into the ocean, will immediately cause sea levels to rise by like 4 or 5 meters, which would inundate about half of the human population. And so you start to see how the planetary boundaries work. The planetary boundaries tell you what changes would cause you to cross these tipping points. We're already crossing some of these tipping points, and they are not isolated from each other. Because if you cross one tipping point, it makes another one more likely. And you have these cascading effects. So this is like a little glimpse into where the state of knowledge is for Earth system science. We know a huge amount about how the Earth works. Let's look at an example of this. A simple feedback loop. If you have global warming, which means the atmosphere gets warmer, that there's a reduction of Arctic sea ice. The ice in the Arctic Ocean, that ice begins to melt. But because ice reflects 90% of sunlight back into space, and the dark blue ocean absorbs 90% of sunlight, the removal of sea ice means less sunlight is reflected from the surface, and the ocean absorbs more heat, which causes the Arctic atmosphere to warm. This is a positive feedback loop. It's an amplifying, accelerating process. This is one of the tipping points. It's called the blue ocean event, when we finally have a northern hemisphere summer with no Arctic sea ice, which is on schedule to happen by around 2030, sometime in the next few years. So the question I have is, what happens when there's no more ice in the Arctic Ocean? Well, we can start to answer that question by looking at this. This is a map of the jet stream. These are jet streams. These are where the air becomes more convergent, like a river of air in the stratosphere. And the weather systems and all the rain follow these jet streams. And this shape here, this classic capital omega shape, this is the shape that gives you rain in winter in the Pacific Northwest. So you get rain because of the jet stream and where it positions itself here. But what happens when all of that heating starts to occur in the Arctic because the ice is melted is all of the jet streams become chaotic, and you no longer have stable weather, and your characteristic climate of the Pacific Northwest goes away. It just goes away. This is how systemic fragility happens, how systemic risk happens, is these interdependencies of the Earth. So, the Earth is a whole system. It's wholly integrated with cascading relationships and with time delays. And the breakdowns unfold across space and time. The key word here is across, which is to say the changes unfold across multiple places and how those places interact with each other through planetary scale processes. But there's a silver lining in this story. The silver lining is that the very same thing that causes this systemic risk is what allows us to build up systemic resilience. if we understand how the Earth works, we can collaborate across places to restore the stability of the Earth's planetary processes. But you cannot do it in one place alone. And that's what we're going to talk about, is how to do that. So I've traveled all over the world. I visited lots of regenerative projects, things like permaculture farms, regenerative agriculture, reforestation projects, ecosystem restoration projects, all kinds of things. And I've noticed that every one of them is limited by the boundaries of the plot of land for the project. Right? It's like you have this great regenerative farm, it's on 10 acres, but it's limited by the boundaries of the plot of land. But every plot of land is embedded within larger ecological connections. Simple example, let's say that regenerative farm is in a watershed, and someone upstream from you dumps chemicals into the watershed. The chemicals will drain across your land because the ecological connections are the flow of water going downhill. So there are larger sets of ecological connections for every plot of land. Those ecological connections organize themselves into holistic landscapes, like watersheds and coastal estuaries and mountain ranges, or as monsoon patterns or precipitation patterns. They create larger scale holistic systems that already organize themselves. And those holistic landscapes are embedded within planetary processes, such as the moisture rising in the Pacific that falls as rain over here. There are larger planetary processes that connect one place to another. When I look at these 4 levels, and I ask myself, where is the pathway to planetary sustainability? And I find that it doesn't exist at any of those levels. I can't find it. But if I shift my perspective ever so slightly, I start to see that the pathway is to work across the levels simultaneously. So if I go into a watershed and start identifying all of the projects, each project is a plot of land. And I look for the ecological connections between those projects through the watershed, I start to see a holistic landscape that I can work to regenerate. And then I'm working across scales, working up and down across scales. This is the secret. This is what we have to be able to do. We have to move up to the scale of holistic landscapes. But then we need our holistic landscape to collaborate with other holistic landscapes to restore the planetary processes. So, this is where I want to share one of those simple statements that's deceptive because it's so simple to say, but it's so profound. Everything that happens on Earth happens somewhere. Everything has a place. Everything happens somewhere. So I want to talk to you about the power of place. So if you look at the North American continent and you say, where are we? It's like, oh, we're kind of right there. There we are. So where is that? What is this place? What does the place show us about how to restore this systemic health and resilience? Well, you know, we can look at it in Google Earth and we're like, oh, we're right here in Seattle. And you can see this is a really complex landscape, right? You can see the Salish Sea, all these islands and channels, and there are mountains, and there's lots of degradation and deforestation, lots of urban landscapes. This is a heavily degraded landscape. Heavily degraded landscape. If you zoom out a little bit, you can start to see, wow, there's so much structure. There's so much structure here. There's so much complexity. You've got the Olympics and the Olympic Peninsula. You've got the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Those of us who know about it, there's a subduction zone and a big earthquake risk. Right? You got the Cascade Mountain Range over here. You got lots of rivers. You can start to see there's this huge amount of complexity that is already held in the land, that the land already has. So when you try to piece this story together, as geologists do, talk to geologists at UW, they're like, that's complicated. This is a really difficult story to tell, right? It's so complex, the geology here. It's kind of amazing. But when we start to ask, how do we do this regenerative work at large scales, it's really interesting to see the power of place. Because every single place has a unique geologic history, unlike any other place on Earth. Every single place has a unique ecological history, unlike any other on Earth. Every place, if humans have lived there, has a unique cultural history, unlike any other place. And when you start to put these histories together, you create the story of that place. The story of place is constructed from the geologic forces and the ecological patterns and the cultural weavings. So when you start to look at a story of place, you're like, what kind of place is it? What kind of life exists here? If humans have lived here, how do they live sustainably? Did they live sustainably? How long have they been here? And you start to see this story of place is very rich and very profound and very full of information about how to regenerate the place. The story of place leads to whole system understandings of that place. What kind of a place is this? How does life work here? What does it mean to live well here? Now, what's interesting about this is the story of place isn't static and it's not finished yet. The story is unfolding right now. All of us in this moment are part of the story of this place. So if you move to a place, you join the story of that place, which means you can help to imagine regenerative futures of that place. You can imagine what stories that place wants. For example, is this a place that wants salmon running in the rivers? Do the rivers want that? Does the land want that? Are there First Nations peoples here who are not recognized for their role as guardians for 15,000 years or longer? Is there a way of restoring right relationship to history of this place? Does this place want her humans in harmony with their own past? So the story of place is incredibly powerful. It's absolutely transformative because it's not finished yet. And it's never finished. It's always unfolding. There's a group called the Regenesis group that helps people tell their story of place, and they like to make it a verb. They say it's the storying of place because you're living the story of a place. And as we do this, we start to see how much richness there is to the work within a place. So let's look at an example. This is an image I took from Google Earth of Eugene, Springfield. This is down in Oregon. And I want you to notice, where is the degradation? Where is it damaged? My daughter loves to draw. She's quite the artist. She'd be able to do this. She'd be like, it's right there, right? Because these are the valleys and the watersheds. These are the places where there's agriculture and the destruction of the land. This is where the forests have been cut down or where the cities have been built. And if you wanted to regenerate this, the land shows you how. The land says, organize around my drainages, organize around my watersheds, organize around my valleys. Because life flows from the water at the top downhill, and the trees at the top bring the rain. And the rain runs down, bringing life to the valleys. And so you do watershed restoration from the top and work your way down. What's interesting about this is if you look at this one, it's about 10 miles from one end to the other, maybe 3 or 4 miles across, and there might be about 100 farms or 100 pieces of land. This is a human scale of organizing. You say, oh, I could imagine going to all the landowners in this place and starting to collaborate to bring the forest back and to restore the ecological connectivity. And maybe it's agroforestry, which means they create a different kind of economy with the materials that come from that forest. And you can imagine this is a human scale of organizing. This could be restored as like a 20-year project in a place. It's completely understandable how to do it. It's been done lots of times at this scale. And now you can see there are 3 of these. The other 2 are a little bigger, but they're still human scale. You can imagine organizing in this way. So if we go out to something larger, this is the Willamette Valley. So now north is that way. Portland's to the north, Eugene is to the south. This is a heavily degraded landscape, a major agricultural zone, the Willamette River that runs to the Columbia River. And you're like, how would you ever regenerate something so large? It's like 100 miles north to south, maybe 50 miles across. It's huge. How would you regenerate that? But the answer is, look where the degradation is worst, have my daughter come out with crayons, And it's the same drainages. It's the same valleys. It's the same watersheds. And so I didn't draw in all of them, because here are the 3 that were in the previous image. And you can start to see that maybe there are 40, maybe there are 50. But you start to see how to organize human-scale projects in parallel with each other to regenerate the Willamette Valley. And then if we go out to the scale of the Columbia River, with 174 rivers draining into it, 258,000 square miles, it's the same size as the drainage of the Colorado River. Frickin' huge. How would you ever regenerate all of that? But look, there's the Willamette Valley. The same idea applies. You go to the local, you look at the shape of the land tells you how to organize, you start regenerating it. At a larger scale, it just means more projects happening in parallel. Move up to the scale of the basin, and you replicate this pattern across all of the basin. And you see how to regenerate this massive hydrological system. It's got nested levels of reality. Every one of these levels is real. There are small streams and rivers. There are fairly large tributaries like the Willamette River. And then there are hydrological basins, which are massive and continental in scale. These are all different scales of reality. So the land tells you how to organize. So if you look at all of the watersheds of the Cascadia bioregion, you see that we could do this. This is the Columbia Basin. This is the Fraser, a major river that is half of the fresh water in the Salish Sea, comes through Vancouver. But you start to see that you could organize and regenerate across all of this. See, this is a powerful way to organize local landscapes. You actually organize the regenerative work around the land. And now you can start to imagine a mycelial web of regenerative projects spreading across Cascadia. So here we are on our Regenerate Cascadia tour. Maybe we plant the seed in all of these places where each place starts to regenerate their local landscapes while collaborating with each other. And that creates some inspiration, so the people down here on the Snake River start doing it too. And you can imagine now how we could fill this whole thing with projects that are working across different levels of organization. Because the organization already exists in the land itself. It's right there to show us how. So to do this work, we can already see the power of the land. But now let's talk about the power of human organizing. How do the humans organize themselves? Remember that word, how do we regenerate Cascadia? So I want to talk about some of the structures of bioregional regeneration. How do we do regeneration at this scale? So once again, we're organized by the land. The land tells us how to organize ourselves. One thing we need to do is create bioregional learning centers. Bioregional learning is learning the story of place. What are the native plants here? How do you care for them? What's a healthy forest? Right? These are parts of bioregional learning. So we need to create bioregional learning centers. We need to organize ourselves around the structure of how to learn systemically about our place. And then we need to create territorial governance. We have to have the capacity of our landscapes to set priorities, make decisions, mobilize resources, allocate resources, track progress, and do different kinds of governance. The way we do all of this is by creating tapestries of local regenerative projects and building ecosystems of learning. So let's talk about how this works. Because all of this requires cooperation. The foundation, the base, is the design of pro-social contexts, which is to say, create shared identity and purpose, create equitable distributions of contributions and benefits, fair and inclusive decision-making, fast and fair conflict resolution, collaborative relations between groups, things that create pro-social capacities, the capacities to cooperate. All of this is implying that we have to be able to work together toward common purpose. Like, do we want salmon in this river? That's a common purpose. We better get everyone together around that common purpose. And so we've been talking about, or I've been talking about bioregions, but I didn't define what they are. And it might be helpful for us to just all have a shared basic understanding. The word bioregion is just short for biological region. Sometimes it's short for biocultural region, which is just biological cultural. And because culture is human behavior and humans are animals, it's animal behavior, which makes it biology. Oh, it's so confusing. Welcome back to the consilience of knowledge. So biological region is the entire context in which the life system of a species can exist. So let's use a simple example, starfish. What is the bioregion for starfish? The bioregion is the entire life context in which they find food, have shelter, reproduce, like everything they need for their life. And so the bioregion for starfish is the intertidal zone. You go to the coastline, and between high tide and low tide and tidal pools is a geography, a spatial region that includes everything that starfish need as a population. That is their bioregion. There's a bioregion for hummingbirds. There's a bioregion for giraffes. There's a bioregion for every living being, so there's a bioregion for humans. But for humans, it's more complicated because humans have worldview and cosmovision. We have technology and model of social organization, right? We have different political and economic systems. We have cultural identities. So for human bioregions, we have these complex tapestries of ecology, geology, and culture. But they're still bioregions. And so if a bioregion is the whole life context for the organism and the species, that means each bioregion is a model of the whole system for its own regeneration. Which means that dynamic process of reproducing the conditions conducive to life, there's a characteristic scale. And the only scale that is regenerative or that is sustainable is the scale that we define as the bioregion, which is the whole life context. So that means that all regenerative cultures on Earth will, by definition, be bioregions, because they will be whole life contexts, everything the life system needs. So now we can imagine how to re-envision humanity's place on Earth. We need to organize ourselves as bioregions. We need to create a planetary network of bioregions. We need to create learning exchanges between our bioregions so we can learn how to do this, so that we can all build that stability and support of our planetary system. We do it across bioregions. That's the scale of organization. Said another way, what needs to happen is we need to recreate the conditions conducive to life, for living locally in terms of material flows. Integrated life systems means humans with the rest of life, the rest of ecology, and the thriving of families and communities. And what I love about this map, this is a map of ecozones, which is if you look at soil type, and you look at weather, and you look at ecosystem, you get a type of ecosystem. And the colors represent different kinds of ecosystems. Now, it doesn't matter which one is which. What matters is that there's not just one color. There are many colors. There are many kinds of ecozones, which means we should expect many different human economies and many different human cultures, each one adapted to its ecozone, to its type of place. You would expect a different kind of an economy in a tropical rainforest than in a semi-arid grassland. They wouldn't have the same kind of an economy. Right? They would be adapted and evolving with their place. If this sounds like indigenous culture, that's not an accident, because that's how they work. So back in 1972, there was this very controversial study that was done. Created a lot of debate and discussion. It was called Limits to Growth. It was the first ever computer simulation of the global economy. And they created a scenario called business as usual. That's where that phrase comes from, is from the Limits to Growth study. And business as usual was not meant to be a forecast, although it's tracked reality with disturbing accuracy, because it shows the human population reaching its peak at 2040, but starting to slow down at 2030, and then very quickly dropping after that, which is the human population crashes in the middle of the century in that computer simulation. So you can see how much controversy that created. Even more controversy that it's tracked reality, but no one gets told that it's tracked reality. But this created such a deep crisis in people in the early 1970s that they gathered the best thinkers they could find to try to figure out how to get to planetary sustainability. And between 1972 and 1983, for about 10 years, they gathered at universities and meeting places all over the world. And they called themselves the Balaton Group, because they first met at Lake Balaton in Hungary. So the Balaton group. And in 1983, an essay was written about the history of the Balaton group. And this is a quote from that essay, written in 1983. Vernon Rutten, who's an agroeconomist, said this: "Each agroeconomic region is so unique that the concept of transfer of technology is irrelevant. What's relevant is the transfer of the capacity to develop technology and institutions that are consistent with the cultural endowment and resource endowment of each region. Said another way, each place needs to build its own institutions appropriate to managing that unique place." And then Dana Meadows, who is the author of the Limits to Growth study, who literally wrote the book System Thinking, said this: "Out of this 10 years of meetings came a vision of a number of centers, centers where information and models about resources and the environment are housed. There would need to be many of these centers all over the world, each one responsible for a distinct bioregion." This was written in 1983. I was 6 years old in 1983. That was 40 years ago. So between 40 years ago and now, this idea that the way to get to planetary regeneration is, or planetary sustainability, is to create local living economies, organized as bioregions, each one having its own bioregional learning center, and do them all over the world. So between 1983 and now, has anyone come up with a better idea? No, because there is no better idea. This is the way. This is the only way to get to planetary sustainability, is to reorganize ourselves as local living economies and create exchanges between them as bioregions, and that each one has its own bioregional learning center. So I want to show you how this works in practice with some of what we're doing in Colombia, because I live in Barichara, Colombia. So this is a topographic map of Colombia. This is the Andes. They make a sharp turn toward Panama right around here. And in this area, there are 3 mountain ranges, and where I live is right here in the middle. And this area that's colored in defines a well-defined climate system, because there's a tall mountain range here, which creates a rain shadow. It's cloud forest, and then we're in the rain shadow on the other side. And the only place the moisture can come in is here, because then it runs into these other really large mountains. And it creates a circulation within this area on a size of about 500,000 hectares, or 1 million acres. And in this area is a unique ecosystem like no other on Earth. It's called the High Andes Tropical Dry Forest. In this place, 8 out of 10 species are endemic, which means 8 out of 10 species exist nowhere else on Earth. And this forest is more than 95% deforested, cut down for monoculture crops, and it's rapidly becoming a desert. So I moved to this place in November of 2019, about 4 years ago. And when I arrived there, this is Barichara right here, I went to this place called Bioparque Moncora, which is where this photo was taken. This is a community reforestation project to restore the native forest on 6.5 hectares of land right on the edge of town. And when I stood here, because I had studied the formation of clouds in graduate school, when I looked up at the sky, I could see that there were clouds in all directions and clear blue sky above, because we had a heat island effect on the plateau. That after the forest had been cut down, it dried out and heated up, and the hot air pushed the moisture away, causing desertification. Which means if I wanted to restore the climate system, I needed to create connectivity of moisture with vegetative cover, which is reforestation could restore the climate system. So when I stood in this place and I started looking around, I could see how there is a characteristic scale, the scale of this climatic system and this unique ecosystem, and it's 500,000 hectares of land, embedded within the boundaries of 3 mountain ranges. So we started getting to work. The way we started getting to work was to do the permaculture thing. In permaculture, you show up and you don't do anything. You observe the patterns. And as you observe the patterns, you start to see what's working, and then you start to support and help those patterns to get better. So what I did in the first year was I started looking at regenerative projects. And I started to see that there were regenerative projects all over the landscape. but they were not talking to each other. They were not collaborating with each other. They were isolated and fragmented from each other. And I could see that these were projects with a track record of success, with people doing things that work. And so I started to weave them together, started to help bring them together. And what's interesting is Colombia has this 58-year period in the last century called La Violencia, the time of violence, where homegrown terrorism was enacted in a multipolar trap that couldn't stop. And basically people were killing each other on the streets all over. It was terrible, which means that Colombians are not very good at collaborating. They have low trust. So the gringo from the outside could show up and show them how to collaborate, and this was actually necessary. Just how ironic the world is. So we started looking at how to create patterns of integration between the projects. And we identified really quickly 4 different territorial patterns. There are more than this that we work with, but these are the 4 main ones. The first one is the restoration of entire watersheds. Because in Barichara, every single river is dead. Every single river is dead. Either there's no water that runs in it at all, and when it rains, it just flushes out into the valley below, carrying erosion with it, or the water is so contaminated that nothing can live in the rivers. All the rivers are dead. This is actually true all across Latin America. So the restoration of entire watersheds means setting up community water councils. It means organizing watershed restoration, soil building, reforestation within watersheds. It's a patterning of how to organize ourselves. Then we also focused on creating a learning center in syntropic agroforestry. Here, the pattern is how to create a forest that produces food, medicine, textiles and natural fibers, and construction materials, the basis of a material economy that is local. And so we started bringing in teachers of syntropic agroforestry to give workshops. We set up 2 public demonstration sites. And in those demonstration sites where we set them up as workshops, then we invited the participants of the workshops to do technical field site visits at each other's land. And we ended up with 30 pieces of land and 2 demonstration sites with learning exchanges spread across them about how to do reforestation that could create a different kind of economy. The third is the transformation of local food systems. Barichara is very lucky because within 10 kilometers of the town, 70% of the food for the town is grown. That's incredible. Most places are well less than 3%. 70% of the food for the town is grown within 10 kilometers, and there's a lot of desertification, which means we could get to 100% food security within walking distance of the town. 10 kilometers is 6 miles. It's close enough that you could walk with a mule or carry things on your back and get food to town without petroleum. So the transformation of local food systems is about connecting the agroforestry systems with each other and the reforestation around the town. And then there's the design of alternative economic models, creating solidarity exchanges, prototyping of time banking and community currencies, of creating a community store that's called Casa Común, where 80 different local producers come together and exchange goods, but sell them to the tourists and create a local economy. So experimenting with alternative economic models based on trust and solidarity. And with these 4 patterns, we're regenerating our landscape. So I want to show you a little bit about how this works in practice. Because everything regenerative that we're doing involves education. It's all about doing education differently. This is an example where Felipe, who's sitting right there in the middle, took children for a walk through the dead riverbeds, where he got permission from the owners of the land to have the children walk through, and then the children interviewed the adults about what happened to the water. This opened up the hearts and the conscience of the adults. As the adults said, during the time when we were shooting and killing our neighbors in the street, the water went away. Because we fought over the water too. And the saying that they have in the Northern Andes is that when people fight, the water goes away, and when neighbors come together, the water returns. Which is true because they collaborate to restore their well springs and their aquifers and their watersheds. And so they started walking the paths of the water with the children leading the way. And then the adults who are experts in different things related to this would start to advise the children. They'd bring in indigenous elders, like this man from the Muisca culture, based in Bogota, to come and give guidance and reassurance to the children. And then the children started working on how to restore the watershed. Here's one of those kids. This is Quetzal. In this picture, she's 6 years old, and she is presenting her ideas about how to restore the Barichara River. Now, you can't read them because it's kind of small print, but my favorite one is when she said, let's take bales of straw and wrap them up, and then let's put mushrooms in them and put them in the river so that they can absorb the contaminants. Because the 6-year-old likes to watch YouTube with her dad, and she learned about mycoremediation. Kids have good ideas. The thing that the kids need is the adults to take them seriously, which is what's happening here. In this scene, I want to show you another principle that's really important in the way education works in Barichara. This is Gabriela and her granddaughter Soraya. Our principle is this: when the adults are having an important conversation, we do our best to have children playing in the center of the conversation. Because if the children are playing there, they will remember what the adults were talking about when they grow up. And the adults who are having the conversation will hold themselves accountable to the future that their decisions are going to affect. This intergenerational relationship is profoundly important. And so we have the children playing among us as we have important conversations. This is a picture of where Bioparque Moncore is, that community reforestation project I mentioned. That's Camila, she's one of the creators of it, one of our local heroes. This is where Bioparque Moncore is on the map. And this is Fundación Monte Chico, where the children go, middle schoolers, go to learn bioconstruction techniques and how to process native plants to make natural fibers and textiles. There's a 5-minute walk along a trail between these two places. When I arrived in Barichara, they didn't know about each other, and they were not collaborating. So bringing people together around common purpose is a really big part of how this works. So if you look at projects like these are all projects in Barichara. You don't need to know what all of them are, but they're all different. For example, Cane Colibri is a community theater where children go to learn. They have theater experiences that teach them the mythic stories of indigenous cosmovision of the Northern Andes, to teach them nature connection and care for life. This one is Corasoma, which is a women's healing group for domestic violence. Casa Común, which is a community store that's prototyping economic models. Origen del Agua is a reforestation project on degraded land. See, they're all different from each other. And when you look at them like this, you don't really see, how would you organize them? What would you prioritize? Which one should work with which other one? You can't really tell. But when you look at them in the landscape, where they sit, it starts to become clear. Because this is the community theater, and this is one of the regenerative agriculture projects. And they are in the same drainage. And so if we were to start trying to restore the watershed, the stream flow, then we could work to connect the education and the theater with the regenerative agriculture with watershed restoration. And we see how the projects can relate to each other. We can see how to bring them into harmony because the land shows us how to organize. So you can start to see how the land shows us the way. But now I want to talk a little bit more about what is a bioregional learning center? What does it do? What's different about it from other kinds of education? Well, one thing is a bioregional learning center is the coordination of existing learning processes. It doesn't necessarily create a new learning process. It might be, there are these nature walks about native plants, and there's this Waldorf school for kids, and there's this graduate program in marine ecology. And how do you coordinate the learning processes? So the Bioregional Learning Center has a primary focus of identifying the learning processes and helping create coordination among them. This means there's a lot of mapping and knowledge sharing. Mapping out, well, what are the different ways of learning that happen here? What do we need to learn about? How do we create a way of sharing that knowledge that is at the scale of the story of our place? Another thing is a bioregional learning center creates the gateway into the community. So if you show up in the community and you say, I really care about trauma healing, It's like, go talk to this group over here. I'm really interested in trees and reforestation. Go talk to this group over here. It's a gateway in to the community's process. Now notice that this is true for someone who's not from the community, but it's also true for someone in the community. I want to get involved in the regeneration of my own place. Where do I go? If there's coordination at a learning center, then there's a gateway into the activities, and you can do wayfinding. You can navigate yourself to where you need to be in your own community. You can find who is doing the work that you most care about so you can get involved. Which right now, if I said, how do you regenerate this area in Seattle? And some of you will know places, but some of you won't. It's not already set for us. A bioregional learning center would create that. This includes advanced modeling and simulation. Like if you think about the mixing processes of the tides within the Salish Sea, it might be nice to have data sensors and high-performance computers and scientific visualization to see how that mixing pattern works for the health of the fisheries or the movements of the orcas, right? And so advanced modeling and simulation, which is normally done at universities and research labs, has a place in this. Advanced science has a place in this, right next to indigenous perspectives and the decolonization of knowledge. How do we live in this place? What is the ethical way to relate to salmon berries? What is the ethical way to relate to Chinook salmon? Science doesn't tell us that, but indigenous education does. So you can start to see how they come together through the bioregional learning centers. And this means the bioregional learning center is both centralized and decentralized. Centralized as it creates centralized coordination mechanisms to enable the decentralization to work and have harmony and coherence. Which means it's an ecosystem of learning, but it also has a center because you need an entry point and you need coordination. And so this is what a bioregional learning center does. Now when we look at territorial governance, we start to see that it is also about mapping and weaving of local projects. But how is that about governance? How do you map local projects? Well, you gather the people who are leading those projects and you have them share what's happening in their projects. And as you do that, you very quickly start to identify needs and priorities among the projects, which means you start to create decision-making heuristics and frameworks just by doing the mapping work. And as you identify the needs and priorities, you start to form landscape partnerships, which is to say multi-stakeholder groups who represent different needs and different capacities within the community that are all part of the same landscape. And these landscape partnerships can figure out how to coordinate and prioritize and how to study and evaluate, how to monitor, how to be sure things are getting done. But to do this, you have to create community funding structures. Why? Because you need the local people and the local projects with their knowledge to determine how to allocate resources. And by the way, that's not just for money. Earlier today, we were talking with our friend Amy, and she's like, Earth Corps brings volunteers from high schools to restoration projects. And kids in high schools have community service requirements. So community funding structures could include volunteer workforces. It can include knowledge. It can include mentoring. It can include tool sharing and time banking and money and whatever is needed. So community funding structures means we identify the things of value and how they move within the community through our landscape partnerships, through the local projects based on our priority needs. This is how we mobilize resources in service to the whole landscape, which will not happen on its own. Without these organizing structures, it devolves into small local competition and infighting. This is how you cultivate local sovereignty. Local sovereignty is created. It's not like you just have it by snapping your fingers. Local sovereignty is the ability to self-govern, the ability to make empowered decisions, the ability to take empowered actions, which requires supportive context. And so you cultivate local sovereignty as this process is happening. The landscape partnerships and the local projects increase their empowerment to manage their own affairs. They increase their sovereignty through this process. And this strengthens collaboration internally and leads toward different kinds of governing systems. So territorial governance is embedded throughout the whole process. And this leads to something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough when we talk about regenerative work, which is how do we fund this stuff at large scales? How does this even happen? Now, this is a model from the Common Land Foundation, which is a group based in Amsterdam, led by a tropical ecologist. His name's Willem Verweerde. At one point in time, he was the director of IUCN, which is the International Organization for Biodiversity. And during his time there, he oversaw lots of conservation projects, and he saw that once the funding for the project ran out, you could cue the chainsaws. Happened over and over again. He's like, we don't need project funding, we need process funding. We need funding to maintain processes indefinitely. And so he started looking for ways to do this at the scale of landscapes, and he started to quickly realize that even though he had wealthy friends, because he's from the Netherlands and plenty of wealthy people there, he's well connected, but his wealthy friends tended to be ecological idiots, which is to say, they're really nice people, they're good at business investing, but when you talk about ecology, it's like, whew, and they just didn't get it. So he's like, I have to find a way to talk to those people because we have to mobilize huge amounts of money. And so he came up with this model. It's called the 5-4-3-2-0 model. 3-2-0 is kind of a joke, but there are 5 landscape processes. There are 4 different kinds of returns: financial returns, ecological returns, social returns, and return on inspiration. Guess which one's most valuable? Inspiration. 10-1, more powerful than the others. And then the 3 is 3 zones for zoning at the landscape scale. It's integrated landscape management. And then 2-0 is 20 years or longer. So what they did is they wanted to fund projects 100,000 hectares or larger, 20 years or longer. And he started asking himself, does anyone ever fund large-scale projects that cost hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that last for 20 years or longer? Does that ever happen? The answer is yes. Infrastructure projects do that. Like Brandon was telling me that the light rail system, the Link light rail, what was it, $58 billion? So $58 billion for the light rail system of Seattle that's designed to be built out over the span of 30 years. Infrastructure projects are a known thing. So when he went to his wealthy friends, tried to get funding for regenerating entire watersheds, he started presenting to them an infrastructure model that they could understand. He said, one thing you'd know about an infrastructure project is that you need a management team. You need a team that can do hiring and contracts and legal, someone that can do the sourcing of materials, someone who can monitor the progress toward all of your goals in these complex projects, which means for a landscape you need, when you translate that over, you need to fund a core team. The core team that manages the regeneration of the landscape as a whole. And he found in practice, because they've been doing this since 2012, that the core team needs about $2 million a year. A team of between 5 and 20 people who are fully dedicated, and you fund them for 20 years to convene and map and set agendas and coordinate and mobilize and prioritize with the multi-stakeholder groups. So just do the math, $2 million, 20 years, $40 million, just for your core team. And they're now doing this in 25 landscapes around the world, and this is what's typical. But then they said, but that's not enough, because you also have to fund the public goods infrastructure. Public goods are things that you invest in so that the society functions. For example, it's hard to have a knowledge economy without your population being educated, so you invest in public education, and education is a public good. It's just good for society to have educated people. It's good for the economy, it's good for people, it's good for democracy, it's good for all kinds of things. So education is a public good. In the regenerative model, the regenerative projects are a public good. The reforestation projects, the permaculture projects, the supply chains for compost and soil building and trees and nurseries and whatever things you need, they're all public goods infrastructure. So they found that the funding of regenerative projects needs to be done to build a regenerative economy. And typically, you need $4 or $5 million per year for your landscape for all of its regenerative projects. So again, do the math, we're talking about $100 million. Here's the interesting thing about this model that they've tested out in practice, is there's a time delay of about 8 to 10 years before regenerative businesses are viable, before you can have a regenerative business with a financial return. Because you need integrated infrastructure. You need basically a regenerative economy that's functioning with its supply chains and its processing and its knowledge, and they all have to be there. And they found in practice this takes 8 to 10 years, which means if you don't have profit, you don't have a tax base, which means your governments don't get it and don't care and don't invest in it until the economy is already working, which is after 8 to 10 years. This is what they found in practice. And so this is just a way of thinking that if you wanted to regenerate a watershed, you would need to fund a core team and build a fund for regenerative projects to weave themselves around the public goods infrastructure that's needed to birth a regenerative economy. This is also called a bioregional investment platform. My friend Stuart Cowan calls it this. So if you imagine a portfolio of projects organized around a specific landscape, if you can create robust circulation of value flow between them, then you manage the risk. Because if you have 20 projects, if 19 of them succeed and they've created new integration and new capacities, then it's money well invested. For any of you who have worked with large funds, large amounts of money, they actually have to de-risk the money before it can move, because it's usually wealth managers, that someone is managing someone else's money and they have legal protections for those people. So this is a way of de-risking or reducing the risk of movement of money into a landscape, which allows much larger amounts of money. Like say, you want to have $1 billion go into your landscape to actually build a portfolio of projects, and all of the coordination and organization enables larger amounts of money to move. So it works like this. You need to have bioregional learning centers to create ecosystems of learning. You need to have territorial governance, that is tapestries of projects organized around priorities and needs, organized as holistic landscapes, which means you need integrated landscape management. And this creates a robust value flow between them. This is how you regenerate a bioregion. Or said another way, you weave the people in projects, you grow their abilities to cooperate with each other, this deepens their ability to organize, and then this births a regenerative economy. And the regenerative economy is bioregional in scale. This is how we do it. This is how we're doing it in Colombia. This is how we do it. And so if you look at something like the watersheds of the Salish Sea, you can see that we could do this in every one of them. You know, here's the Quinsam, here's the Powell, right? Here's the Dungeness Quilcene, here's the Skagit, you know, you can start to, here's the Duwamish. Like, what if we did this in each of them? What if we built regenerative economies across each of these watersheds for the Salish Sea? What's interesting about this map is when I go to the next map, notice the similarities. These are watersheds, and these are indigenous language families. Notice that they're not exactly the same, but they broadly overlap, because a language family is what emerges when there's a long period of extended trade. Extended trade creates shared language, which means the shared language happens within watersheds and among neighboring watersheds. And this is how the indigenous people have organized themselves for thousands of years as bioregions, as whole-scale tapestries of landscapes organized around watersheds with regenerative economies. This is what an indigenous lifeway is. Which means we can learn from all of these people about how to create a regenerative economy because they've done it before. And because these are their ancestral lands, they care about the regeneration of their landscapes, which is the perfect place for that cooperation to emerge. So our Regenerate Cascadia tour has a logic to it, which maybe makes a little bit more sense now, which is that we want to create this pattern of nested levels of cooperation. So we started in the Columbia River Gorge, then we went to Eugene, then to Portland, then after Portland we went to Olympia, then we went to Vashon, then we actually jump across on a ferry to Port Townsend, and over to Victoria, Gabriola, Bellingham, Skagit, and then back to Seattle. And in 30 days, we're having the same conversation. How do we regenerate Cascadia? With the idea that each place starts to organize itself locally and collaborate with other places. And we weave them across Cascadia. And as this happens, we can build collaborative funding and governance and organizing around our watersheds. And this creates the patterning for how we regenerate Cascadia. So if you look at the entire North American continent, you'll notice that the land has already organized itself as watersheds. So when Penny and I started doing these bioregional activation tours, which was in January and February, we went up to the Great Lakes. And we started traveling between towns wherever we were invited, giving talks and workshops about how to weave the regeneration of bioregions for the Great Lakes Basin. We were in southern Ontario, the Finger Lakes and Genesee River of upstate New York, the Cuyahoga River, and northeastern Ohio. So we're in a little corner of the Great Lakes, but we were starting a pattern of how to regenerate the Great Lakes. And that work continues, and there's going to be a Great Lakes Regeneration Summit in February coming out of this work. And then in May and June, we went from the headwaters of the Colorado River to the Sea of Cortez in Mexico, visiting communities where we were invited to have conversations about what it would take to regenerate the Colorado. About a month ago, landscape leaders from 6 of these places gathered in Paonia, Colorado, which is in the western slopes and is one of the headwaters, to have a leaders summit about how to regenerate the Colorado River with bioregional learning centers. And that work is continuing right now. And here we are in Cascadia. And you can start to see how to regenerate a continent. Because conversations are already bubbling up in the bigger basin, the biggest basin in North America. People are talking in the Ogallala Aquifer in the western part of the Great Plains, where there's the Buffalo Nation Trust working to do regeneration of the Great Plains. There's the driftless region in Wisconsin and Minnesota. You can start to see how we could regenerate entire continents. And so we need to create bioregional networks across every continent on Earth. My little joke is we could give Antarctica a pass for now, but all the other ones, because this is how we do it. This is exactly how we do it. And so we created a design school for the work that we're doing at a planetary scale. So people all over the world are gathering to regenerate the Earth at bioregional scale. So we're organizing a planetary network of learning exchanges between bioregions. So if you want to work at that planetary scale, you can join us in the design school. But really, you're already in the design school, because we're living out, even if you've never read my book, because I have copies if you want them, but The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth, even if you haven't read the book, you're actually in its pages. Because the design pathway